Picture the biggest building in your city that is not an office tower or a stadium. A vast hall of glass and steel, wide enough to park a fleet of jumbo jets inside, with a footprint bigger than most shopping malls. Every few weeks it fills with thousands of strangers wearing lanyards, and they pour into the hotels, pack the restaurants, and hand the whole city a tidal wave of visitor money. A convention center. There are hundreds of them across America, and cities fight each other to build the biggest, shiniest one they can. It sounds like the safest bet a city could ever place. It is not. Almost every convention center in America loses money. Not by accident. On purpose. Phoenix once spent $350 million building a hotel beside its convention center because no private company would touch the deal, then sold it years later at a loss so ugly the state tried to ban cities from ever trying again. This is the economics of owning a convention center. Why a building designed to lose money gets built anyway. Who actually pockets the profit, since it is never the building itself, and why the bills never ever stop coming, long after the ribbon is cut. The building every city wants start. With who owns these things? Because the answer is the first clue. Almost no convention center in America is privately owned. Look for the owner, and you will not find a billionaire or a real estate fund. They belong to cities, counties, and public authorities. Run by government boards and quasi-public agencies most residents have never heard of and never elected. Why? Because a private investor ran the numbers, saw a building that loses money by design, and walked away. The biggest of them all is McCormick Place in Chicago, a complex so large it feels like its own city. 4 separate buildings, millions of square feet of exhibit floor, run by a public authority everyone just calls McPier. In the 1990s, McPier spent $1 billion to add more than 800,000 square feet of hall, betting the mega shows would keep growing forever. New York built its Javits Center for $486 million. Boston poured another $240 million into expanding its hall, and afterward, the city's hotel occupancy barely moved. And once one big city builds a giant, the next city down the highway feels it has no choice but to answer with a giant of its own. They borrow, they build, and they cut the ribbon on a cathedral of commerce. A building meant to pull the entire country into downtown for a weekend at a time. On paper, it is civic pride you can walk through. On the ledger, it is something else entirely. A hole in the budget, with a very nice lobby. What you inherit, by the dream of owning one, and here is what actually transfers to you. Past the glossy renderings. First, a building that is empty most of the time. A convention center does not run a show every day, or even every week. It runs a handful of big ones a year, a few dozen smaller ones, and between them, the whole sits dark and silent. One study found McCormick Place, the flagship of the whole industry, empty 45% of the time. Nearly half the year, the largest convention center in America is a vacant box you still have to heat, cool, light, insure, and guard around the clock. Second, you inherit the labor. Convention halls run on union crews, with strict rules about who can wire a booth, hang a sign, or move a crate. And those crews cost the building money whether the floor is packed or bare. Third, you inherit the debt, and it is enormous. Some authorities have borrowed so heavily against their halls that they have run straight into their legal debt limit. That billion-dollar hall was built with borrowed money, and the bond payments arrive on schedule no matter how many events show up. Added up, the empty days, the crews, the debt, and a picture forms. You did not buy a business. You bought a very large, very expensive obligation that happens to host a trade show now and then. Where the money actually goes. How is a convention center supposed to make money? This is the twist that explains everything. It is not supposed to. Not inside its own walls. A convention center rents its space cheap and hands out sweeteners to land a show, sometimes at a deliberate loss, because it is not really selling floor space. It is buying a crowd and renting that crowd to the city around it. Think of the soda at the front of a grocery store, sold below cost to pull you through the doors. The convention center is the soda, priced to lose. The city is the store, and the store is where the real money is made. Once thousands of visitors are in town for the show, they sleep in the hotels, eat in the restaurants, ride the taxis, drink in the bars, and shop between sessions, and every one of those dollars gets taxed, again and again. all week long. That tax, collected all over downtown, is the real product the convention center exists to sell. In fact, most convention centers are funded by a special tax on hotel rooms, a bed tax, sometimes stacked with a tax on rental cars and restaurant meals. It means the building is paid for by the very visitors it is built to attract, who never notice the charge buried in their nightly rate. The center loses money on the room rental so the city can win it back 3 blocks away, in tax on a hotel pillow and a steak dinner. When it works, it is clever, one of the sharpest moves in all of public finance. The problem is a single number that tells you how often it does not. The number that breaks it here is that number. Between the year 2000 and 2010, the number of people attending conventions in America did not grow. It fell. It dropped by nearly a third in a single decade, from about 126 million attendees a year to about 86 million. Read that again. The convention business was shrinking year after year, and during those exact same years, cities all over the country were borrowing billions to build bigger and bigger convention centers to chase a crowd that was walking out the door. More space, fewer guests. More halls, emptier halls. More supply, less demand. Every mayor was promised that a shiny new hall would steal conventions from the next city over, and every city was making that same bet at the same time. Nobody wanted to be the mayor who let the big show slip away, so everybody kept building. They were not competing for a growing prize. They were fighting over a shrinking one, each armed with the taxpayer's checkbook, and most of them were going to lose. The ledger now walk the real ledger. An empty convention hall is one of the most expensive things a city can own. An idle machine that eats money just to sit still. You are lighting, cooling, and staffing a space the size of dozens of football fields on the chance a show turns up next month. You are paying crews, security, and management year-round for a floor that hosts paying events only a fraction of the calendar. And every year, the operating budget comes up short, so the city quietly writes a check to cover the gap. Phoenix is a clean example. In one recent year, events at its convention center generated about $6.6 million in state tax revenue, while the state had put more than $24 million into the place that same year. The math did not come close to closing. In St. Louis, the local convention agency takes in more than $16 million a year for operations, plus another $33 million for debt and upkeep on the hall and its dome, and the hotel and restaurant taxes meant to cover all of it fall short by millions of dollars every single year, a gap the public quietly fills. And when something like a pandemic hits, it gets far worse. In 1 year alone, the shows lost to COVID cost the McCormick Place economy an estimated $1.7 billion, proof that all that fixed cost does not pause when the crowds vanish. This is the part nobody mentions at the ribbon cutting. Across the country, the story rhymes. The building does not pay for itself. You pay for it. Every single year, forever. The trap, and here is the trap that makes it worse instead of better. Once the hall stops filling, the advice from the consultants is almost always the same, and it is never to shrink, expand. Add more space, add a headquarters hotel, add an arena next door, spend your way out of the hole, and the conventions will surely come back this time. So the city that is already losing money borrows even more to get bigger, because if it does not, the convention will just move to whichever rival city did. Every city is caught in the exact same race, borrowing as fast as it can, just to stay level with the neighbor it is trying to beat. Nobody can afford to stop building, and nobody can really win by building, because they are all expanding into the same shrinking pool of events at the same time. It is an arms race paid for with public money, a bidding war where the prize keeps shrinking even as the bids keep climbing. The convention center that was sold as a one-time investment quietly becomes a permanent demand for more money. And the only thing worse than owning one is owning one that has fallen a few years behind the city next door. The man who saw through it. One man spent much of his career explaining exactly why this keeps happening, again and again, in city after city. His name is Haywood Sanders, a professor who studied convention centers for decades and wrote the definitive book on them. The title alone tells you where he landed. It calls the whole enterprise a set of follies. Sanders documented something damning, and other economists backed him. One put it bluntly, that virtually every convention center in the country loses money, and building a newer one does not magically make more conventions exist. The attendance projections cities use to justify these buildings are almost always wildly optimistic, and they almost never come true. The pattern runs like clockwork. A consultant is hired. The consultant produces a glowing forecast of visitors and tax dollars. The city borrows against that forecast. The ribbon is cut, and the crowds never match the promise. Then, when the numbers disappoint, another consultant is hired, and the fix is almost always the same one word: expand, and the cycle begins again from the top. Sanders showed that this was not a run of bad luck in a few unlucky towns. It was the pattern, repeating across the whole country for decades, dressed up each time as a bold new plan. There is always a next study, and it always says, build. The forecasts sell the buildings. The buildings rarely pay them back. The hotel that nobody wanted, for the sharpest example, go back to Phoenix. In the early 2000s, the city wanted bigger conventions, and it had already committed hundreds of millions of dollars to a huge expansion of its convention center. But the experts said it needed one more thing: a large headquarters hotel next door to house the crowds. There was just one problem: no private developer would build it. They looked at the same rosy projections the city was relying on, ran their own numbers, and quietly passed. That should have been the warning. So the city of Phoenix decided to become a hotelier itself. It borrowed and spent $350 million of public money to build the largest hotel in the entire state, 1,000 rooms of it. Ground was broken, the tower went up, and it opened in 2008, at the worst possible moment, straight into a deep recession that emptied the very conventions it was built to hold. 8 years and roughly $28 million in operating losses later, the city gave up on being a hotelier and sold the hotel for $300 million, tens of millions less than it had paid to build it. Even that sale nearly collapsed, and the hotel later changed hands again for less. The loss was so public and so painful that lawmakers in Arizona pushed a bill to ban cities from ever building a hotel again. The building that was supposed to fill the convention center instead became a warning label bolted to the skyline, 30 stories of proof that no amount of concrete can force a crowd to show up. The survivors? Who actually makes this work? A few cities do, and they share one honest trait that the strugglers never accept. People already want to go there. Las Vegas and Orlando do not use a convention center to invent a reason to visit their cities. They already have the reason. The shows, the strip, the theme parks, the beaches, and the hall is just the room where the money changes hands. The centers that survive tend to sit inside a place people would fly to regardless, packaged tight with the hotels and the attractions, so the visitor was coming anyway, and the convention is just the excuse. The smart owners also stop lying to themselves about the building's real job. They measure the building the honest way, by the hotel nights and the tax dollars it drags into the city, not by whether the hall itself turned a profit, because it never will. And they resist the loudest, most expensive temptation of all, the urge to keep expanding a building that is already too big for the crowd it can draw. They build to match the crowd they can honestly draw, not the crowd a consultant sketched on a slide. Discipline, in this business, means knowing when your city is not Las Vegas. The verdict. Does owning a convention center actually work? In the right place, yes, in a strange way. A center in a true destination fills 10,000 hotel rooms a night, feeds 100 restaurants, and keeps the airport humming. And the flood of bed taxes and sales taxes it throws off can pay the city back many times over, even as the building itself quietly runs at a loss. The building bleeds, and the blocks around it bloom, and on balance the city comes out ahead. That is the loss leader working exactly as designed. But in the wrong place, and most places are the wrong place, it is one of the worst deals a government can sign. A mid-sized city builds a mega hall on a consultant's rosy forecast. The crowds never come in the numbers promised. The thing sits dark half the year, and the debt and the subsidies bleed the general fund for decades. Money that could have paved roads, fixed schools, or paid police. By the time the mistake is obvious, the money is spent and the concrete is poured. You cannot easily sell it. You cannot cheaply close it. You can only keep feeding it year after year and hope the next show is bigger than the last. The loss leader, because in the end, a convention center was never really a business at all. It is a bet a city places on itself, with the taxpayers' money, that the crowd it buys will spend more out there, in the hotels and the streets, then the building loses in here. Sometimes the bet pays off handsomely, often it does not. And when it does not, the city does the one thing that feels unthinkable and is somehow always the answer. It borrows more, and it builds a bigger one.